So next up, we have another presenter joining us today. We have an environmental historian and renowned author, Philip Terrie, who is joining us. He does have a new book slated to be published in 2025, Wild Forest Lands, Finding History and Meaning in the Adirondacks. So he has taught American and environmental studies at colleges in Ohio and New York, and we have that book being published in September 2025, so something to look forward to for all of us. Welcome, Phil Terrie, to the stage.
Thank you, Nicole. Right. Good afternoon. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you to the Wild Center for inviting me, and thank you for all these people who are interested in this subject, particularly if it involves the history of the Adirondacks, which I've been studying for about 50 years. Obviously, we're not talking about house fires, hotel fires, inn fires, things like that, and businesses that were common throughout the country in historic times. If you Google fire in the Adirondacks, you come up with this hotel or this great camp or this village fire somewhere. We're talking about wildfire. In an age of minimal firefighting equipment and all wood buildings, they were all too common. As we just learned, we environmental historians know that fire as a management tool was common throughout the country. It was particularly common in the northeastern United States, and I'm not sure that has really penetrated the larger culture yet, but we know that when the first English explorers started sailing up the coast of New England, they encountered a land that had been managed for centuries. They didn't realize that at the time, but now environmental historians have paid good attention to that, and we know that that fire was a very important management tool for indigenous people throughout the Northeast, and that includes the Haudenosaunee of New York. Now, the evidence is, as far as I can tell, that it was less so in the Adirondacks than in central New York and the Finger Lakes, the Hudson Valley, and western New York. There's considerably less evidence of that in the Adirondacks, probably because of temperature regimes, the climate at the time, and elevation, other factors like that. Okay, we have to acknowledge that as an element in the history of the Adirondacks, something we don't know much about and we need to know more about. I'm going to start at about the period roughly of the Civil War. At that time, there was settlement around the periphery of the Adirondacks. There was a few settlements in the interior. There wasn't much logging going on at that time. Minimal settlement, very little clearing, not much happening. Something disrupted that, obviously. And the major disruption in the Adirondack environment, beginning at about the time of the Civil War, is logging. Before the Civil War, only softwoods were taken. It was for construction and the like. They were taken out on river drives. Mostly it's the periphery, around the area that we would associate with the blue line now. This picture obviously comes from later because there are no photographs of that earlier time. It was an age of ruthless resource exploitation, cut and run logging. And that leads to a new way of thinking about the environment. This is a Vermonter named George Perkins Marsh. He wrote a book in 1864 called Man and Nature, or The Earth is Modified by Human Activity. Basically, he was saying that you cut down all the trees on a mountainside or let them burn down, and you destroy the capacity of these mountain slopes to control erosion, runoff, and you get endless cycles of flood and drought. Marsh was in the American, what was then the Foreign Service, in the Mediterranean in the 50s and 60s, and he pretty much said that the Roman Empire fell because they cut all the trees down on the mountainsides. And in fact, there's an element of truth in that. There's also an element of climate change. But Marsh wrote this book in '64. It becomes a bestseller. It is the beginning of the conservation movement in the Western world. The idea that if you do something in one place, there are consequences somewhere else. Now, I'm sure farmers had known that for millennia by that time, but the educated classes were just catching on. It raises for the Adirondacks the question of state intervention, that should the state be concerned with what happens to the land in a certain place, even if it's privately owned. The reason the state is interested in this is because the Erie Canal and the Hudson River are the absolute drivers of the New York State economy. The Erie Canal was opened in 1825, and that is what made New York the Empire State. All that corn and beans from Indiana gets to New York. Should the state be concerned about the Adirondack forests, which are starting to be chipped away on the outer parts, and if that happens, according to Marsh, the Erie Canal becomes no longer viable? Wildfire is seen as a threat to the welfare of New York State. So the state gets involved, and it takes a long time for the state of New York or any other state to do anything once it decides something is important. And throughout this history of this state, if there's a problem on the table, we appoint a commission to look into it and file a report. Well, that's what happened in 1874 when a commission that had been appointed by the legislature to look into should we have a park in the Adirondacks. And in this report, the reason for having a park is fire. The threat of fire is seen as a threat to the welfare of the state of New York. New York will not prosper if fire is not addressed in the Adirondacks. Well, surprise, surprise, nothing happened. But only a few years later, 10 years later, another commission is established. A professor at Harvard named Charles Sprague Sargent is head of a committee and said, you investigate. What should we be doing about the forests of the Adirondacks? Because in the intervening 10 years, those fires were getting a little closer. They were taking more of the Adirondack forest that seemed so essential to the welfare of the state. And there were several threats to the forests, and you can see them here in this order. The main one was fire, because the logging in those days, this was the understanding at the time, that the loggers would cut down, at this point, mostly softwood trees, a pine or a spruce, take a good log out of it, and leave everything else on the ground, and just walk away. Don't move that around, and trees, branches that are sticking up from trunks dry out, and it becomes an obvious target for fire. But the sergeant, I like this line, the sergeant report says there is a desert belt around the remnants of the Adirondack forest. This is in 1885. It's on the periphery. It's also important to remember that there's no clear cutting at this time. They're taking only softwoods. Okay. The Sargent Commission suggested that the state should own all of the Adirondacks. It also said that's impossible. We can't do it. So in the meantime, what we need to do is start a forest preserve out of what the state owns now and gradually enlarge it. So the state will control enough of the forest in the Adirondacks that we have a protected core that will protect the Adirondacks as a watershed. And slowly getting into the picture in the 80s is the idea that not only is the forest important for the watershed protection, but it's becoming an increasing attraction for spiritual engagement. That people want to go camping. They want to see the wilderness, what's left of it. They want to go hunting and fishing. They want to see what North America might have been like at a different time. This becomes a subject of popular discourse, that the whole state, the whole country is talking about this. What are we doing to what remains of our natural heritage? This is a lithograph from Harper's Weekly, published in 1885, and it's a powerful piece here. The one on the left is called A Feeder of the Hudson, as it was, and on the right a feeder of the Hudson as it is. That is a hillside that has been devastated by fire. It's eroded. There's no water in that creek anymore. This is a powerful piece of persuasive argument. And in that very year, New York does in fact create the Forest Preserve. At that time, what it owned in 10 counties in the north and 4 counties in the Catskills becomes the Forest Preserve, the New York State Forest Preserve. And the language in the law creating the Forest Preserve, that the lands constituting the Forest Preserve shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. They can't be sold. They cannot be alienated in any way from state ownership. It also said there will be logging on state land in 1885, because it was hoped that the emerging science of forestry could be pursued conservatively, responsibly, and that this would be a source of income to the state. It was only a very short time before the state, in its collective wisdom, decided at this point we cannot trust the foresters. We can't trust the loggers. There is stealing, there is theft, there is logging where they're not supposed to be. And in 1894, as everybody interested in the Adirondacks should know, we had a constitutional convention. And at that convention, the delegates passed unanimously what was then Article 7, Section 7 of the Constitution that went into effect on January 1st, 1895. The lands of the Forest Preserve shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. Now, nor shall they be sold, removed, or leased or anything else. Not quoting exactly right now. But it added to the Forest Preserve Law of 1885, nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. No logging. And the reason why no logging was added to the Forest Preserve provision in the New York State Constitution was a fear of fire. Fire drove the events that gave us the political arrangement that we have in the Adirondacks today. All right. Here is a map from 1890. We have the very beginnings of a conservation bureaucracy emerging in the state because of the state's concern with the Adirondacks. It's a little bit hard to read these colors, but just the orange level, see the color in the third one down in the right hand, those are areas that have been burned as of 1890. And you can see they're largely on the outside. Look at how much is considered virgin forest at this point. It's almost all privately owned, but there's a lot of forest left in the Adirondacks in 1890 that has not been logged. I think there's probably a lot of argument among forest historians about exactly how much was virgin, how much maybe some of the softwoods have been removed and not the hardwoods, but that's a lot of woods. There's a slightly better map that you can see. The green there is how much the state owned. So most of that land that was considered virgin forest in 1890, the state didn't own. So that constitutional provision did not apply to those lands. And so logging continues. And in those days, the logging that was done, as I said a minute ago, was pretty irresponsible. It was cut and run. Get all the profit you can out of that land and abandon it. Don't pay any taxes, and eventually it will be owned by the state or bought up by somebody else. And the logging boom, it's interesting that at just the time the state is implementing these protective measures, creating the Forest Preserve, it's also creating the Adirondack Park, which that's the original blue line, 1892, which didn't have a whole lot of teeth. It was basically legislation showing that area of the Adirondacks in which the state had an interest. It's the headwaters of all the major rivers. And this is where the state wanted to acquire, to concentrate its acquisitions. This era of the state taking dramatic action to do something about the Adirondacks, largely because of the threat of fire, is precisely the era when logging really takes off. And one of the reasons for that is the process by which paper is manufactured from wood pulp. Before that came along, which is, I think it's invented in Germany in around 1867 or 68 or something like that, paper was always made from fabric. And it was expensive and time-consuming, and paper was you didn't get much paper. Most people had 1 or 2 books in their house. After the process by which paper can be made from wood pulp is invented, paper becomes cheap. Hence, we have the expression pulp fiction. The newspaper rags, and paper is all over the place, and a lot of that paper is made from Adirondack spruce. And so logging explodes in the Adirondacks. All those lands that were so-called virgin in 1890 are intensely focused on by logging companies, and who are acquiring land. If they don't already own it, they're logging it like hell, and they're sending those logs to market. And at that time, a lot of the trees that are taken to market from the Adirondacks are taken out by locomotive. Narrow gauge railroads that are not intended to last very long are laid into the interior, especially when there's not a big river that you can run the logs out on. And those railroads are fueled by wood and coal, which throws sparks. So you have a combination of the nature of logging at those days, which is leaving all kinds of debris all over the ground. You have railroads that are throwing sparks all over the place, even though it's illegal. There are regulations in place that they're supposed to have spark arresters, and they're supposed to clear the tracks on 50 feet on either side or something, but they didn't pay any attention to that. The fines were minimal, and most of them were never caught doing that anyway. So this leads to the big fires. All these elements have come together with one further element which tilts everything in the wrong direction, and that is a drought. And it wasn't just in the Adirondacks. Stephen Pine, who's a fire historian, writes that the era from 1870 to World War I, he calls it the great era of holocausts, an unrivaled tinderbox of abandoned slash. What happened in the Adirondacks? In April, a huge crescent burns from upstate New York all the way to Maine, with about 1 million acres destroyed, 600,000 of which is in the Adirondacks. Ignition came primarily from railroads and the smudge fires of fishermen, and the fires tended to cluster around tracks and streams. I'm going to go into this fire in a little bit detail. There are 2 great fires here, and we have more information and better maps on the 1903 fire. And the drought element here is absolutely catastrophic. In April, the rainfall in upstate New York averaged 2.2 inches, most of which fell before the 11th. No rain fell in April after the 17th. In May, the average rainfall was about 0.2 of an inch, the least ever recorded in the Adirondacks for that month. In June, until the 7th, only traces of rain are reported. In the 51 days between April 16th and June 7th, there was about 0.2 of an inch of rainfall. That's bad news. On cutover lands, the debris left after lumbering was ready to catch fire like tinder and to spread it almost like a powder magazine. Throughout the Adirondack region, which is one great forest broken only by lakes, marshes, and clearings, I'm reading from a report from the Department of Agriculture that was issued after this, every chance spark left unextinguished by smoker or camper, every glowing cinder from locomotive or brush burner's fire carried the potentiality of a great conflagration. And that's exactly what happened. The locomotives were throwing sparks. The logging companies did not want to take care to stop these, and look at the red marks on that map. In Newcomb, in this report, we read, last spring, the warden and several men ran for 2 miles, closely pursued by the fire, and finally escaped only by placing a lake between themselves and the flames. In April, a farmer near Lake Placid lost control of a fallow fire. It caught in the duff and smoldered there until the 3rd of June. Adirondack fires go underground. When an unusually strong wind fanned it into a surface fire, which traveled 8 miles in 2 hours. It leaped clearings and streams. At times it proceeded through meadows, making a path only a few feet wide, and then, driven by the wind, burst into a roaring conflagration, which in a few hours devastated a tract 6 miles long by 3 in width. These are apocalyptic fires. The largest fires in 1903 in Lake Placid, including the Adirondack Lodge, which burned down, 14,000 acres. In Keene Valley, from Cascade to St. Hubert's, 18,000 acres. On the Nahasani Preserve, which is the Webb property, where Lake Lila is, 12,000 acres. Catlin Lake, which is just east of Long Lake, 10,000 acres. Horseshoe Lake, right around the corner from here, 10,000 acres. The Rockefeller Preserve, just north of here, 40,000 acres. And in the case of the Rockefeller Preserve, it's worth noting that there's one more cause of some of these fires. Some of them were deliberately set. At the same time the state was establishing the Forest Preserve and indicating an interest in the Adirondacks, a lot of wealthy people from downstate were saying, well, I've got an interest in there. I'm going to buy up a bunch of land and post it. And nobody can go in there anymore. And it was claimed in several of the accounts of these fires that they were deliberately set by people who were angry about posted signs in places where they were used to collecting firewood and hunting and fishing and had been for generations. Skip some of this. 75,000 acres probably were burned that were deliberately set. One of the reports wrote about this. The rapid increase in the number of extent of private parks and game preserves in the Adirondacks and the resulting decrease in the area open to all for hunting and fishing have engendered strong feeling against private preserves on the part of some who do not enjoy their privileges. Many of these private preserves were badly burned in 1903. But the state paid a lot of attention to this and started collecting data about what can we do about it. One, enforce the current laws about sparks thrown by railroads. The deliberately set fires add a kind of a interesting element to this, but they're a minority of the fires. Most of them were accidents by campfires left unattended and mostly railroad sparks. The state said we need more money. We need to have an effective fire suppression regime, which means people and money in order to get it to work. What happened? Nothing at that point. And then here's just some of the statistics that illustrate what I was just going through there, about the amount of land that was burned. It's interesting that only 100,000 acres of state land, 530,000 acres of private property burned, but I think that's roughly proportional because the state didn't own that much at that time. I think these fires were roughly equally distributed between state land and private land. What it looked like, this is the year after the fires. This is it's interesting how few photographs there are of these fires. I had a very hard time finding photographs to illustrate this, including nothing for the next big fire, which is 1908. This is the only map I was able to track down that gives some indication of the second great fire, which was 1908. The darker areas on this map the light colored are the 1903 fire, The darker areas are 1908. And again, it's a drought year. But this must have been an even worse drought because the 1908 fire was in September when the canopy is still closed. The April has always and May have always been and sort of middle of October into November are the fire seasons in the Northeast because the canopy opens up, the sun reaches the floor, and it all dries out. The 1908 fire began in September and it burned. We'll talk about exactly what it did. Laborers were brought up from New York City to fight this fire. 6,000 men were organized to fight the 1908 fires. And Stephen Pine, the fire historian, says that if you consider what was known at the time, New York, in fact, once this fire, it's not a fire, it's a collection of fires, once it began, New York did a really good job of fighting these fires. They used the latest technology. They did a better job than the federal government did with fires that same year in the Northwest. New York pretty much knew what it had to do to keep these fires from being so bad. They had to change the techniques of logging at the time, so much slash and debris is not left on the ground where it can dry out. It's got to control the railroads. It's got to educate the public about not leaving your campfire burning. I was hiking just off the Northwood Placid Trail about 2 weeks ago and came to a lean-to, and there was a fire in the fireplace, and nobody there. I got a bucket of water and put it out. And I hope those people came back expecting their fire to be going and found it gone. And, you know, the ground around there was wet, and it wasn't going to start a forest fire. But for God's sake, where's your brain? Okay. Drought year, and then the story that we always tell, and I'm about to retell it for you, is what happened in Sabattis or Long Lake West in the 1908 fire. If you're driving between here and Long Lake, there's an intersection, and it says Sabattis. There's two of those because it makes kind of a Y, and that used to be a railroad station for the train that came up from central New York to Tupper Lake and then to Saranac Lake and Lake Placid. And there was a little village there called at the time Long Lake West. And the fire of 1908 devoured everything. This was the one that we know the most about and that had pretty dramatic the way it played out. The Long Lake West fire destroyed everything in its path. While residents were evacuated, nothing was left of the town except charred embers. The heat generated by the fire melted barrels of nails into lumps. Miles of forest surrounding the town were incinerated, along with a dozen homes, the church, a school, the Wilderness Inn, a livery stable with room for 200 horses that had been set free to fend for themselves, and I'm sorry to say I don't know what happened to those horses. A freight warehouse containing 50 barrels of kerosene and 1,500 pounds of dynamite. The intense heat of this fire twisted the railroad track. And the people who were still there, either trying to fight it or had been living there, jumped on a train at the very last minute and got to Tupper Lake, and nobody was killed. It's a pretty dramatic fire. But a major consequence of this fire is that the state said, we are moving in. We're going to do something about this, and we're not going to let this happen again. All parties clamored for better protection, and the state fire organization was thoroughly overhauled. The Forest Preserve was divided into 4 fire districts, each with a supervisor, observation towers, and paid patrolmen. The land itself, not merely the towns within it, was made the basis of fire control. Reforms were also promoted in the field of fire prevention. Locomotives were required to burn diesel fuel and not wood or coal. State inspectors ensured railroad compliance with fire codes. The state enacted tougher statutes against careless campfires, and the legislature empowered the governor to close the reserves during fire emergencies. The first fire tower was on Mount Morris, also right around the corner from here. That's not the fire tower, because the original ones were built out of wood. By the 1920s, they were built out of steel. And they quickly became hiking destinations, as they are to this day. This is a further little insight into the changing attitudes toward the land up here. Around the period of World War I, the state sees its role in protecting the Adirondacks less and less as watershed protection, because the fire danger, in fact, is rapidly diminishing in the Adirondacks, to promoting recreation. So the fire towers are the perfect marriage of those two goals. The fire towers become hiking destinations, they become educational facilities. There's somebody up there to talk to people, to learn about the history of the Adirondacks and what they're seeing out there. By 1909, many new laws were passed with the goal to prevent and detect forest fires earlier. These included controlling locomotives. Logging companies were required by law to limb everything left behind. If you cut those branches that are sticking up and make them touch the ground, they rot a lot faster. And fire towers and state patrolmen are hired, and the fire threat is largely controlled. I have a number of questions that I don't know the answer to. I'd love to see an entire 20th century with rainfall patterns throughout the Adirondacks. We know that terrible drought was responsible for the fires of 1903 and 1908. We know that the state took dramatic regulatory powers to control the elements that it could control, which is the way logging was done and what the locomotives were doing. Have we had another drought comparable to 1908? I know we had some very powerful droughts. We had a bad year of drought in the mid-'60s, and there was talk about closing off part of the forest reserve to recreation. There was a major fire in 1915, but that's pretty much at the beginning of the new regime. We know that in 1950, the year of the Great Blowdown, that the state decided that fire was a terrible threat to the forest reserve, and an attorney general issued an opinion that the state could contract for salvage logging on the forest reserve. An absolute violation of what was then Article 14, Section 1 of the Constitution. It was renumbered in 1938, but nobody fought it. That would be an interesting research for someone who's looking for a master's thesis in environmental history. Why was it that the state got away with that? Because it was a clear violation of the Constitution. We know that in 1995, there was a powerful wind that swept across the Adirondacks. There was a derecho, a straight wind fire that put down a lot of trees on both private land and state land. And there was talk that the state ought to go in there and do some salvage logging because there are going to be fires. Well, at that point, there was opposition to this opportunity, and the state did not do any such thing, and there were no major fires that developed from the derecho of 1995. All right, because of this change, this 20th century change, the expression asbestos forest was applied to the Adirondacks. Here's another question I have. Who first used that and when? I was just thinking about that today. I started hearing it in the 60s and 70s, but did it come earlier? Somebody tell me if you know. But it was an article of common sense wisdom in the Adirondacks. Oh, they have those big fires in the West. We're never going to have one here. It's an asbestos forest. Well, that's not looking ahead very clearly. We know that in 1903 and 1908, we had catastrophic fires. We know we're not logging the way we used to, and we know there aren't railroads throwing sparks. Does that mean that it can't happen? I wouldn't be so sure, and I think that's why we're all here. We have changing weather patterns, as we all know. I had to cancel a hike the other day because I didn't think it was safe for me to go climb a mountain. I'm in an elderly part of the population, so it said don't exercise strenuously. things are changing. That's, as we all know, and I think as everybody is going to say today. Okay, that is all I have, frankly. Here's just a quick look at my sources, if you're interested. Some of those sources I quoted directly. If this was a paper, I would have put a footnote and indicated exactly which one each time, but I didn't feel the need to right now. Okay, I will be glad to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Phil. We appreciate it.